Harris with Varato, and today we're going to talk about open source software, one of my favorite topics. Quick background, open source has been around as a concept since the 50s. Some of the rules around licensing and stuff were dates to the 80s, and the big thing that put it on the map is the Linux operating system. Started in 1991 by Linus Torvalds. And it is Linus Torvalds. I believe I said that right. So the operating system runs the server software that runs all the internet, most of the internet. Apache runs on Linux, Nginx runs on Linux. And if you're browsing the web, you are hitting open source software, using open source software in your browser or on your phone. And that is most of the web servers out there. So the internet is run on open source software. That's the bottom line. And it's been that way for decades, and it's been very, very stable. So the basic idea of open source software is that you can take a copy of the software, you can play around with it, you can distribute it, you can do whatever you want. It's open. There's some parameters around the license, but that's like, I don't want to get into that. You can research some of that yourself, or I'll save it for another podcast. But there are different types of licenses, but it doesn't matter. Closed source is what it says. It's a lot of SaaS, software as service platforms, are closed source, and the source is owned by the company, and you have to have the rights to use it, and you can't to build on it and to code it, and you can't distribute it. So that's the main idea. Open source is kind of like community-based. The contributions are community-based. There's no direct incentive, monetary incentive to work on it, although people make careers out of it by servicing the software. Whereas closed source is typically private companies or, public companies, but profit-based corporations or private companies that need to make money on selling that software. On my screen is a list of a bunch of notable software that's both open source and closed source. Linux, Apache, MySQL, WordPress, Nginx, Magento on the open source side. You've got SAP, Oracle, Microsoft, Windows, Salesforce, and AWS on the other side. So there's a lot of big companies doing both models. What I want to do is just kind of get a little bit, dive into the e-commerce platforms that are either closed source or open source, and just use e-commerce platforms as a way of kind of showing you the general pros and cons of open source versus closed source. But because I know e-commerce really well and I know these platforms well, I'm going to just blast through some pros and cons of each, closed source versus open source. And that might give you a good idea of where some of these trade-offs are on if you're trying to pick one of these platforms to run your e-commerce business, or you're thinking about moving to another system. So the big players on the open source side are Magento and WooCommerce. There's also PrestaShop, OpenCart, OS Commerce, some other ones, but the big two are Magento and WooCommerce. On the closed source, it's the big two are Shopify and BigCommerce. But then there's also Adobe Commerce, but Adobe Commerce is Magento open source underneath it, which is kind of complicated. And I've done another podcast. I'll do another podcast just about that. But then there's Salesforce, and then there's Wix and Squarespace, which are kind of like do-it-yourself platforms. They're not really important. So it's basically like Magento, Shopify, for the sake of argument. Those are the two big players. Let's just think of those two. So ease to launch. So what is the easiest one to launch? If you're going to look at open source versus closed, or you're just going to look at Magento versus Shopify, Shopify is easier to launch. Real easy. Cost to launch. Actually, Shopify. It's cheaper. Because it's fast, it's cheaper. Open source software is going to take a little more time to launch it. You're probably going to need somebody to help you. It's really hard to do it yourself. And it can take a little bit more time. So that's one of the trade-offs. Now, the total 5-year cost of ownership. Once you get it up and running and it's open source, you have to find somebody to host it for you. If it's closed source, you're paying that company to host it for you. Software as a service, you're essentially leasing this software. that lease agreement is going to build over time. That's going to become more expensive because of the leasing fees annual and the take rate, which I'll get into in a second, which is how much that platform is going to take over every transaction, right? So fast and affordable to get up and running, more expensive over time. A bigger investment to get it up and running on the open source side, but have more controls over costs over time. So open source typically is going to be a little bit lower to cost to own for 5 years. However, caveat that with a bunch of but if, because every business is slightly different. But in general, I would say that. Okay, vendor lock-in. Vendor lock-in is what everyone complains about with these big SaaS solutions. So software as a service is you don't own it. You're leasing it. And you get what you get. You can customize some of it, but sometimes you can't. And, it's a closed system. So you might be able to do some apps to do what you need, but essentially you're going to get what you get. And then every time you re-up your contract to lease the system, that company can change your fees. They can change the fees. And it's really expensive to get off of it. So now you're locked in, vendor lock-in. Open source, you could have one company host it. You could have a few different partners help you build it. You pay that licensing fee. If those fees don't seem fair, it's open source. You can just move it to another company. Of course, that's going to take some time, but it means that you have leverage. You have leverage because you could say, well, I don't want to pay this. I don't want to pay this amount every month. There's another company that can charge me less than that. And then, so the market has to decide what's fair. If you're in one single system, there's nowhere you can move it. You're either on that system or you have to re-platform. And that can be a really risky downstream cost that's going to be hard to control, if not impossible to control. Okay, take rate is that percentage. The next thing is take rate. That's that percentage that the platform is going to take on every single order. Think of it as a credit card fee plus, and it's usually 2.5 to 3.5. Can be even a little bit more than that. And then you add in so you have to do pay per transaction, and then you also have to pay for the monthly leasing fees. That take rate is going to be higher with closed source systems. So again, that 5-year expense, open source, you have more control on your costs. You can bring those take rate down, particularly if you're doing B2B, which there might be no credit card transactions. So there's zero take rate, only those hosting fees. So for B2B in particular, the take rate is much, much better, much more flexible on open source. And then development costs. Development costs are kind of like really dependent on the system and what you're trying to do. But in general, because open source software is a community and the community is invested in supporting the system, it's typically easier to find people to do custom development work for you. You can do custom development work on closed source systems, but again, there's parameters. And if it's not a big, big system with tons of developers like Shopify, if it's a smaller, like more closed system, then it can be really hard to find people to do a development. And supply and demand, if it's really hard to find people to work on it, once you do find them, it's going to be expensive. So, a really good, healthy, thriving open source system, usually those development costs are pretty reasonable. And then the next slide is customization and flexibility. Open source obviously wins that hands down. And then support's a trade-off. Again, it depends on who you're working with on the open source. You're going to need a partner on the open source, and you're going to need someone to host it. If those people are good, then the support will be good. Whereas with a closed source system or Shopify or BigCommerce in this example, that company will help you support it. And sometimes people, find that support's really good. You can just put in a ticket. If the site goes down, they'll bring it back up. So sometimes it's a little more turnkey and the support is a little more predictable. So it really depends on how you're doing the open source solution. So support, I would say, is a wash. I'll put that's kind of a draw. Abandonment. So if you're looking at the 5-year costs of these platforms, what you don't want to do is pick a platform that doesn't have a large adoption rate in the marketplace. And because after 5 years, you could get abandonment. And this has happened over and over and over again. Software is littered with companies that are software that was really popular for a while and then it became abandoned. I would say that closed systems, when they get abandoned, they just turn them off. Whereas open source, they can get abandoned, but not completely. Like they could kind of die over time slowly, but then they just keep on chucking. Whereas like a closed system, they turn the keys off. They give you a warning and you've got to re-platform, and one day it will completely stop working. Whereas there's a lot of small open source systems, there's still enough of a community to keep them going. But there's going to be risks on both sides in terms of abandonment. And then the last thing I want to talk about is durability. So again, you don't want to hitch your wagon to a system that's going to have abandonment. And that abandonment could be because, costs get too high, or the company never made money if it's closed source system, or some other system in the marketplace just became much better. And so people will switch to this new system that's better. And so the durability factor is really like, will this software continue to evolve? Will it continue to play an important role in the industry and in the marketplace? And can I sustain use of this system over time? And I would argue that open source is more durable because of its structure. Because you have people, stakeholders, invested in the support of the software, that community, and then all the companies using it, they're not going to really let it die. And if the model is not dependent necessarily on profitability. So in a closed source system, that company that's supporting it, making sure that it is durable, that it is scalable, and that it evolves, that entity has to continue to make money and generate profits. Otherwise, they're going to close their doors. Whereas open source is way more flexible. It has the ability to keep going on and going on and going on because the people using it need it. And so they keep supporting it. And it doesn't matter if they, if the entity behind the software is profitable, if the software is performing a function and people need that function, it'll stick around. And it goes back to Linux and Apache. Again, Linux was started in 1991. That's the operating system runs the entire internet. That is a long time in technology, particularly modern technology. So I would say open source is more durable. So those are the factors that to kind of take into consideration when looking at open source versus closed source. I'll just leave you with this. The reason I built Varato as a brand, the reason we're working on it is to give you kind of not unbiased opinions or unbiased information, facts. Like, what is it, because these decisions that companies make as they're re-platforming or as they're going through a digital transformation process, those are decisions that can live with them for years to come. And a wrong decision can lead them down a path that can be very painful and very expensive. And a good decision can make them better, more agile, and thrive, essentially. So these decisions are important. And with Varato, I want to bring an unbiased, unvarnished, real life, like, this is what I believe, or these are what the people on the show believe or whatever. So, but that being said, everybody is a little bit biased. Like, it's impossible to be completely unbiased. But I truly believe in open source software. I'll say that. Given that I've been in this industry since 1995, I truly believe that open source is a pretty revolutionary concept, and it works surprisingly well, and it's been and proven to be surprisingly durable. So I don't think Magento is going anywhere. I think it's going to still stay. It's going to prove the test of time. The kinds of things that businesses need now in this kind of next generation of e-commerce, they're going to want to build platforms with a lot of customization, a lot of integrations with existing systems, mapping to business rules, mapping to price books, all of that stuff. And then they want to kind of own that thing, and they want to be able to modify it and support it. And they don't necessarily want another company in the way, essentially restricting what they can do or adding on costs because that private company has to support a big marketing team, a big sales team. They have limited engineering. That's what happens in closed systems. So, I might be a little biased on this, but it's also based on experience. That being said, if I was a certain kind of company and I wanted to put up an e-commerce site and I wanted to do it fast, and I knew I didn't need a lot of customizations, I would just go with Shopify. So there's definitely a place in the marketplace for closed systems. But anyway, I think open source is cool. It's something that people should read about, learn about, not be afraid of, because it's obviously running most of the stuff we see on the web right now, and it will probably continue for decades to come. So thanks for listening. Thanks for watching. Again, this is Matt Harris with Varato, and we will catch you next time.